Okay. Welcome to another session of trade interviews for INTJ Forums. I'm your host, TGA, and today I'll be interviewing IotaNull. Iota, want to say hi to the
Hi.
group? Oh, well, you jump right in. Okay. All right. Well, we'll kind of jump right in terms of the questions. We're very similar format. So, jumping right into it, Iota, do you by any chance remember the first time you've had testing or an experience with MBTI?
It was in about 2008, so I would have been 16 years old. Um, I was doing various personality quizzes on the internet, came across MBTI. I fairly consistently tested as INTJ, but the exact extent to which I have, how it gives you percentages for I and N and whatever, those tend to vary quite drastically. But the type has been fairly consistent. I actually started lurking on the forum about that time, but obviously you're not allowed to join up until you're 18, so it wasn't until I reached that age that I actually signed up.
Oh, okay. Well, in terms of the percentages, which is kind of your strongest trait in terms between from I to J?
Um, I actually don't know. Usually T, but none of them are actually particularly strongly pronounced, which is probably why a lot of people have commented that I come off very differently to a lot of the other INTJs on the forum.
So you feel like you're kind of more on the cusp, like say in the 50s
Yeah,
range, or?
I think, um, with the possible exception of T and F, I think most of mine are reasonably balanced.
Okay. Well, then, when you were kind of reading on the archetype of an INTJ, have you explored any other personality traits, or did you just kind of settled with INTJ?
I've looked at other type descriptions. I found that INTJ profiles tend to suit me best, but I'm also aware that sometimes MBTI tests have a kind of Forer effect going on, where where what's being described is actually applicable to a lot of people, but the individual people reading it think it applies specifically to them. So I've always been a bit wary of that. And of course, there's some bias because I think a lot of people think that the INTJ description sounds particularly badass or positive or whatever. And that's another bias that needs to be accounted for. So I guess I wasn't really sure that I was an INTJ until I really started interacting with people on the forum and got other people's opinions.
Mm. Okay. Have you ever looked into potentially being any other type or been mistaken for
I've
other
looked
type?
into it quite a bit. I tend to rely on other people's perception for that, and again, most people have consistently said I'm INTJ. Some people who met me thought I might be INTP, but I personally don't see that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think anyone else has ever suggested any other type. Seriously.
Who
Okay.
said you were ITP? You don't.
Sea Blue and Litchi when I went to meet them in France a couple of years ago now.
Oh,
Oh, okay,
I'm
that's
pretty
interesting.
J, so that's interesting.
Yeah, you come across a bit more J than P, but okay. Well, then, kind of go into your strong traits. You mentioned T. Uh, what are the top, I guess, three stereotypes of an INTJ you feel that you fall very much
I
in line
think
with?
I generally come off as a very logical person. It used to be more pronounced than it is now, but I studied maths and philosophy at university, which I guess probably answers one of your later questions as well. So I've always been naturally inclined towards being a logical thinker. I've probably enjoyed my logic classes more than I enjoyed any other subject, that kind of thing. Um, I'm, this is a surprisingly difficult question for me to answer. I sometimes I can be socially awkward, not as much so as you might expect, but and again, this is something that was more pronounced when I was younger. And hmm, and I guess my interests are quite similar to those that INTJs typically have, but I'm not really sure how to elaborate on that.
Okay. And on the flip side of the coin would be what would be the two or three traits that you don't find yourself as a typical INTJ or probably even at odds with?
I think I'm fairly socially confident nowadays, so that would be the big one. That's more or less the first thing anyone has commented on when they've met me in person. So, what else? Sorry, these are surprisingly difficult questions for me to answer.
No. Well, we can kind of come back to it and can move back.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah,
I'll
we'll come
probably
back to
think
it.
about it when I get more into the flow of things.
Okay. So in terms of your interests and passions, you mentioned you were very much into philosophy and the logic side.
Yeah.
What other side hobbies or passions do you have as well?
Well, I do a lot of reading. Uh, I'm a pretty big gamer, I suppose. I've done a lot of gaming, particularly Nintendo gaming, throughout my life, and that's fairly consistently been an interest of mine. Um, I haven't had a chance to do it for a while, but I do really enjoy fencing, actually, and I find that to be more of a mental exercise than a physical one.
Oh, fencing. Okay. So when did you kind of pick up on fencing?
It was offered as one of the options when I did PE classes at school, and I was too curious not to. They've brought in various extracurricular tutors over time to do that. So I got interested in saber at first, but I fairly quickly found that foil was something I was better at and enjoyed more because it seemed to be, like I said, much less physical, much more mental. And basically, I just continued my classes after I got out of school. Unfortunately, while I had a steady community of people to fence with, I pretty much had to stop visiting my hometown on a regular basis shortly after I started university, and I just fell out of the swing of things. It is something I would very much like to get back into. I've never lost interest. I've just lost opportunities.
Oh. Is it just because the environment you're in don't have a lot of fencers, or just the time commitment you just don't have?
Both.
Ah.
But it's more the fact that I don't have the connection with the community that I once did.
Uh-huh. But is there a fencing kind of community where you're at?
There is, I just haven't had any opportunity to get involved with it yet. I find that's the case with a lot of my hobbies, actually. I find myself more attracted to them by the community than because the hobby itself is particularly interesting and enjoy them for that reason. And I suppose that's another thing that you might think is very stereotypically not INTJ, because I think they're typically viewed as very solitary and pursuing intellectual interests for their own sake. And I wouldn't say that fits my pattern. I mean, it's true for the solitary hobbies I have cultivated, but not that many of my hobbies are solitary. You know what I mean?
Okay. So does that, so in terms of between I and E, it sounds like you're somewhat weighted
Yeah.
towards E, at least on the hobby
I have
side?
considered the possibility that I might be an extrovert. It's just I don't relate at all well to the ENTJ profiles I've read.
Uh-huh. Hmm. Okay,
It, it,
because a lot of the activity you mentioned or emphasized a couple of times in terms of the community and
yes,
being
it's
active with.
something that's quite important to me.
Mhm. So.
I guess while community is important to me, and this would be something that is typical of INTJs. I wouldn't say harmony is that important to me. I think pretty much everyone on the forum knows this by now, but I'm a very confrontational person. I don't shy away from conflict at all, and I tend to value truth over tact. Is where I'm going with this.
Mhm. Okay.
And
S
if that has social costs, then so be it.
yeah.
I'm not completely insensitive, but I'm leaning in that direction.
Okay. Well, then in terms of, because you mentioned you kind of looked in towards ENTJ and it doesn't really jive or fit well with you as an archetypal persona, what part of ENTJ just doesn't fit well?
Um, I don't actually remember that much of the ENTJ profile. This is an assessment I made a long time ago, and like I remember what I decided, but I can't remember why I decided it.
Oh.
Um, I think I didn't relate to the idea of being intentionally provocative or wanting to get into positions of power or anything like that.
So you're trying to say
And
you
that's
don't
about
specifically seek out on it?
yeah.
Oh.
Recognition, positions of authority, things like that aren't really something I seek out. I mean, I'll take them if I'm good at them, but
Mhm.
that's about it.
Okay. All right, then kind of going backwards in terms of kind of traits that you don't fit well with an INTJ, the whole community and I guess the somewhat extroverted part might be towards part of it. Is that probably why? I mean, let's going towards your E and I then. What it was, if you remember from the last test, or kind of a theme of the MBTI test, has been the split. between E and I?
I usually get a pretty even split between the two. It's like I can't. It's a bit of a difficult question because some tests, 50% is the even mark, and some tests it has 0% as the middle mark, and then it goes from 0 to 100% in each direction.
Mm-hmm.
But I've fairly consistently been more or less at the middle between those two, and I'd say I've become more straddling the middle as I've gotten older. I used to be very introverted when I was young. I think that was more because because I lacked opportunities to socialise rather than because I didn't want to. And the questions tend to be phrased in such a way that they ask what you actually do rather than what you'd ideally like to do.
Uh-huh. Okay. Well then, other than the whole fencing part and the community-driven part of your particular hobby, is there something else that might push you towards being more E?
The fact that usually I'm the one to initiate social gatherings. I'm the one to when I'm in a social situation, I'm usually the one to get the ball rolling on trying to get things done or get conflict out in the open, that kind of thing. I'm not at all socially passive.
Oh, okay. So you're kind of somewhat the architect in terms of getting people together, while everyone is just kind of more
Yes, I
passive.
suppose so.
Do you find that as something you've picked up on, as you mentioned, as gotten older and more socially confident, or is it something that you've always done?
A mixture of the two. I've gotten more confident at it, but at the same time, it's always been my natural inclination. It's just that generally I don't try to do something unless I'm sure I'll be good at it.
Hmm. Okay. Well, then looking back then, if there was a particular weak side or trait side that you would like to change or uh, remodel after, what would that be?
Hmm. I don't know. I can't. I'm pretty happy with myself as I am, to be honest. I suppose if there was one thing I had to change, it'd be that I'd like to be less socially anxious and more able to get things done without worrying about whether I'll be good at them. But at the same time, that caution has always been shown as where it's happened. It's usually been a useful trait. So
Okay.
no, I wouldn't say there's nothing wrong with me, but I'm not sure there's anything I particularly think this is something I want to change either. If there's something I want to change, it's usually about the world around me rather than something I
Mhm.
don't like about myself.
All right. Well then.
Well, I suppose one thing would be I wish conversation flowed a bit better in interviews because I find that when I'm being put on the spot, it's difficult for me to think in the moment. And people comment on this a lot actually. When I'm the focus of the conversation, I tend to need to take pauses to think about what I'm going to say. So I guess relating to that, I can be a bit perfectionistic at times, and that's something I would like to change.
Okay. Then kind of going a little backwards in terms of organizing groups, when you organize these social gatherings, is it tends to be more of the same friends or your same clique, or is it a new gathering or a new event? Let's say, for instance.
Usually with the same friends. When it
Okay.
comes to new social groups, I mean, I'll quickly get into a position where I'm confident trying to organise things, but at the start I prefer to be invited. Basically, I look for confirmation that I would be suited to do it first, and then I do it once I have that confirmation. That's fairly reflective of my attitude towards most things, actually.
Mm. So
One
okay,
thing
so if
that
yeah, go ahead.
oh, sorry. One thing that struck me was that when you're talking about how you'd rather change your environment rather than change maybe something more internal, that kind of seemed to me more like an ENTJ thing rather than an INTJ thing. Could you maybe give your thoughts on that?
I have to admit here that I'm not actually that familiar with all 16 MBTI types. It's something I have a passing interest in, but um, I'm not intimately familiar with functions or um, the nuances of other types or anything like that. So it's difficult for me to make an informed comparison.
Okay. Then kind of moving forward here then in terms of being typed as an INTJ, what would be, I guess, the one trait you hold proudly as?
You mean my favorite trait about being an
Yeah.
INTJ? The fact that I'm a logical thinker and I'm usually fairly good at detaching myself, and even when I'm not, I'm generally aware of that bias. I'd say that's the one that's been the most useful, distinctive, and all-around favourite.
Then in terms of the...
It's the one thing I view as this is an actual positive rather than just viewing it neutrally as a trait about myself.
Yeah. Okay. Then in terms of stereotypes most people hold on INTJs, what would be the top 2 or 3 you would like to address or dispel?
Well, when it comes to dispelling them, what I would like people to do is for people who read an INTJ test to stop reading it and thinking, oh, this is something I need to aspire to, and then massively exaggerating those traits as a result. For example, I see this a lot on the forum, where people try to come across as unfeeling or hyperlogical when... Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Give me a second.
Sure.
I think a lot of INTJs try to come off as unfeeling, and play up the whole emotions are useless thing. They try to say sensing things are useless. Basically, I want to dispel this idea to other INTJs that being an INTJ necessarily makes you better. Other than that, I'm not really sure. There's obviously any stereotype, there are going to be some people that meet it. And so, again, this is a difficult question for me to understand and answer.
Well, I guess we can always come back to this one then. Going back to all the way up to, I guess it was question 2 or 3 in terms of you were talking about traits that are not exactly fitting with a typical INTJ. You mentioned growing to be more socially confident. Can you kind of give us an example of what you mean by that?
I've become much more confident at initiating meetings, more aware that making a mistake isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. And I think basically the driving factor for that was the realization that nobody else is perfect at it either. This reminds me of something, actually. When I was much less socially confident, there was a time I went to see my maths supervisor, and I took it really personally when the conversation was really awkward. And it wasn't until a few years later when I met him again that I realised that the problem was with him being socially awkward, not me. And I think that realisation and ones like it were defining changes in my attitude towards this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so was it kind of a slow growing event, or
oh yes, definitely. It's more a gradual evolution over a course of about 7-8 years, maybe even more. I definitely describe myself as someone who's always looking to improve themselves and who sees themselves as always evolving.
So that event with your master's advisor, was that kind of more of a tipping point for you in terms of realizing?
I guess so. Yeah, it wasn't the only thing that... It was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak.
Okay. So has there been any other major changes similar to that event, or is that you would kind of attribute that as the one and only straw?
There probably have been other similar events. I just haven't committed them all to memory.
Okay.
Again, going back to what I said earlier about being able to remember the conclusions I drew from something without being able to remember the process itself.
Mm-hmm. Then, okay, let's look into some, I guess, major events in terms of that might change you. What would be one, if any there is, that really impacted on you as a person or personality-wise?
Um, well, the time I got into my first relationship changed me quite a lot, I think. It very much affected how I dealt with people. It was more the experience of being close enough to a person that it wasn't easy for me to just write them off as flawed. So it made me think much more about how I handle conflict resolution. And I got much better at conflict resolution as a result of that. It helped me become more understanding of feelings and the idea that just because someone doesn't necessarily think the way I do, doesn't that doesn't necessarily imply that the way they think is worse or flawed or something. It's something I need to take into account if I'm going to be socially successful. Stuff like that, basically. The sort of thing you would normally expect from close interactions with other people.
Okay.
But I guess I wasn't really that close to anyone in my family, which is why that tipping point for me came much later than it did for most people, I would imagine.
Well, then when you mentioned in terms of not being close with family, is it because they're much more extroverted,
Pretty much,
or?
pretty much everyone in my family is A, an ESFP, and B, dumb.
Oh.
So I find it really difficult to interact with them at all because I'm not averse to having small talk, but they're the kinds of people who'll have really obvious small talk conversations and come out of them thinking that they're being really insightful. It's difficult for me to pretend to be interested in that kind of conversation. The reason I don't mind small talk in general so much is because even if the small talk itself isn't interesting, I can usually find a way to make it interesting or add my own little flourish to it or something like that. But I just don't have that kind of opportunity with my family because it's so hard for me to relate to them on any level. I don't dislike them by any means. I just have to keep them at a distance to maintain my sanity.
Okay. Well, have they tried to understand in terms of how you work as an INTJ, or is it just you kind of keep yourself at a arm's distance and they're kind of doing the same?
No, I think they're the kind of people who decide that if you aren't like them, that makes you wrong. So I wouldn't say they've ever really made any serious effort to understand where I'm coming from, except in the sense of them thinking, here's what I need to improve because I'm not like them in that respect. And I think having to deal with that so much when I was younger it was another reason why I'm so hesitant to write other people's modes of thinking off as lesser now, because I know what it's like to be on the receiving end of it.
Okay. So, okay. I mean, I guess we can look at that as kind of a positive, somewhat influence or change.
A lot of positive influences in my life haven't necessarily been people actually showing me how to do things. It's been them showing me by example how not to do things. It's a bit of a cynical way of doing it, but if it works.
Yeah, I guess we try and pull what good things we can out of a bad situation here.
That's something I would say I excel at nowadays.
Yeah. Okay.
My
So,
attitude towards, well, pretty much any situation actually is my first instinct is to try and at least find something good about it. Like if something goes wrong, then I'll try to find a way to learn from my mistakes, things like that. I found that to be a very important skill, and I realise I'm somewhat kind of going off topic here. Sorry about that.
no problem. So kind of going back in terms of the family part, so or they're all either E or F in a certain way, and they just there's no other I or T like persona in.
Other than my recently deceased granddad, no, not really. I think everyone in my family I can think of is clearly ESFP specifically.
Wow.
I think I'm the only person in my family who has any kind of any type variance whatsoever.
Do you feel that there could be, or think that there could be some that are hopping on the ESFP wagon because everyone is doing it, or there are actually genuinely all ESFP?
As far as I know, none of them have ever taken an MBTI test. This is me typing them.
Oh, okay.
But it's not one of those cases where I'm just being presumptuous based on how someone interacts with me. It's more like the traits are so overt and obviously pronounced that there's no way you could mistake them for anything else.
Hmm. Would it be possible due to either their upbringing or just kind of the social expectations or the culture there that they might be exaggerating certain traits?
I do think they exaggerate them, yes, in the interests of fitting in or trying to live up to what they think is a perfect person. But that's not something I can comment on in more detail because, again, I haven't psychoanalyzed them that carefully.
Okay.
They aren't an interesting project. Is the best way I can put that.
Uh-huh. Okay. Well then, well let's dig a well, if possible, we can dig a little bit more with them. Then would be
Okay.
the professions or the interests they hold. Are they all very much aligned with ESFP, or maybe some of them might be doing something that, on a more, I guess, analytical career or profession basis?
Um, I can't think of anyone else in my family who's even employed or anything like that. My late granddad was an accountant, but other than that, no.
Okay.
No, I wouldn't say there's anything particularly interesting to say there either. They all have the attitude towards jobs that they're there to pay the bills, and that's pretty much it.
Ah. Okay.
I don't really get any enthusiasm on almost any subject from them, really.
Okay.
It's all always about doing the dumb thing.
Wow. So you're kind of really sticking out like a sore thumb there. Okay. Well
I
then,
definitely feel that way, and a lot of people comment on it when they see me with my family as well,
yeah. So is it even that much obvious or overtly obvious to your, I guess, close friends when they're seeing you with your family then?
which isn't often, but yes.
Okay. So
I
then,
purposely chose to live far away from home when I went to university so that it wouldn't be practical for my family to just spring surprise visits on me every week. So so I guess my social life is very compartmentalized in that one group of friends will very rarely meet another group of friends. That's not an intentional choice, it's just the way it's turned out.
mhm. Okay.
Which I suppose actually makes going back to the organizing the social activities thing, I suppose it makes that easier because you don't have to worry about whether these two people will actually get along.
So then, kind of going a little step back in terms of you organizing these social activities,
Yeah.
do you find it would be kind of your way or an outlet to interact with those that are like-minded? Because it sounds like, from childhood you're very much in a household where you're just, you
Not
really don't have
necessarily
anywhere.
like-minded, but at least to the point of being relatable. I don't specifically choose people for that reason. It's more like, I mean, I choose my friends based on common interests and how well we naturally click, and it just so happens the people I naturally click with have more in common with me than my parents do, because pretty much everyone in the world has more in common with me than my parents do.
Is it, okay. Could it be possible that the circle of friends or your current social network is because they're very much aligned with your studies? Or is it because...
Um, I don't know many of them through studies. It's more common interests. Like some of them I fenced with, some of them I've played a lot of video games with, some of them I've just met through societies that I happen to enjoy. Things like that.
Mhm. Well, then have you perhaps met with other ESFP, or do you have another ESFP in your circle with similar interests?
Yeah, I've met a few ESFPs other than my parents, and I wouldn't say it's easy to get along with them, but it's easier than it is to get along with my family.
Mhm.
Although that might just be because I've been so overexposed to my family that I have a much lower tolerance for them as a result.
Oh, okay. well, well, then what would be these similar interests? Would it be fencing or the gaming group?
Lately, mostly the gaming groups, because obviously I haven't been involved with fencing for a while.
Mhm.
And the rest, those who I haven't met through gaming groups, people who I just knew in school and happened to stick with. The kind of people who you're friends with forever, pretty much, regardless of whether you still have anything in common or not, just because you have that history, and that history is a way for you to relate.
Mhm. Okay, then kind of looking into the gaming group itself, you mentioned you played Nintendo games in the past. Like, what do you play now?
I still play a lot of Pokemon, but I'd say the main gaming hobby for me is tabletop roleplay. Um, thing I like the idea of getting into a group and kind of putting on a different mask for a while, uh, playing a character with completely different personality traits to your own and seeing how well you can do it and exploring that aspect. I suppose you can view it as a social experiment for me. Because I definitely enjoy the roleplay parts more than I do the combat parts of games such as Dungeons and Dragons.
Okay. Well, we are getting close with the 30-minute mark, so I'll end the interview with one last question, a scenario question. So looking
Okay.
into, if you had a choice in terms of picking or perhaps even changing the archetype of your family, or particularly even your parents, from ESFP into any other type, would you do it, or would you keep them the way they are?
It's difficult to say whether they would even still be the same people at that point. I don't think personality types are something that you can just mix and match and expect them to be fundamentally the same people afterwards. So I'm going to have to say that I don't accept the premise of the question.
Okay.
Well,
Well,
they'd
if
still be your parents, right? So,
Well, yeah, but that's
but
literally it.
if you could change them, would you? Or would you just rather keep things the way they are because you just accept the fact that your mom's like a certain way?
I suppose in an ideal world, I'd like to have parents that I got along with, but I'm not even sure what such a relationship would necessarily look like. I have nothing to work with, and obviously that would change me as well. So, yeah, this is a difficult question, and it's one I have trouble making sense of. Possibly because I'm overthinking it so much. But
what is kind of your gut instinct telling you?
my gut instinct is that in an ideal world, I would like my parents to be different. I wouldn't say I have a specific way I'd like them to be different in mind. Just that if I had a choice between this and some random other assortment of traits, then I would probably take my chances with the random assortment.
Okay. All right. Well, that kind of ends our interview here. Thank you so much for volunteering, and Unkind Human for volunteering and doing some of the recording here. And
Yeah, sorry if that didn't go as smoothly as I would have liked.
oh no, it went by just fine. 30 minutes just kind of blew by faster than.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Okay, I'll stop the recording here.